Welcome to another episode of Speaking of the Arts. I'm Long Bay Symphony Music Director Charles Evans, and today's topic will be the single piece that we plan to perform on our next series concert on March 28th. A complete staged version of Igor Stravinsky's Story with Music, The History of a Soldier, or The Soldier's Tale. Russian-born Igor Stravinsky is regarded widely as the most influential composer of the 20th century. Around the turn of the last century, when he was just starting out, the music world was going in all sorts of different directions, breaking away from the tonal system that had governed it for so long. If you make a comparison with what's also going on at this time in the visual arts, you have Impressionist painters such as Monet, Expressionist painters like Edvard Munch of the Scream fame, and even the Cubist Picasso. They were all striking out, breaking away from the realism in the visual arts. Well, the same thing was happening in music as composers sought new ways to create expression in a more abstract way outside of the standard tonal system. And Stravinsky, as he developed his style fairly early on, became the preeminent model for composers. His style became sort of the most pervasive thing, to where even very original composers, highly regarded composers in their own right during this period and well into later periods in the 20th century, they would inevitably be gauged to some degree on how much their music emulated Stravinsky. So Stravinsky himself very much emulated the styles and aesthetics of his teacher, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, of fame writing masterpieces like Scheherazade, Capriccio Italien, and so on, and many operas. But Rimsky-Korsakov had brilliant orchestration, relied a lot on Russian folk tunes, and also created novel harmonic and melodic patterns. Well, Stravinsky really held on to that kind of stuff and ultimately took it on to the next level. In around 1908, still a very budding composer, when Stravinsky had a couple of his short orchestral showpieces performed, Fireworks, which the symphony did a little over a year ago, and Scherzo Fantastique. In the audience was the founder of the famous Ballet Russe and a very influential impresario, Serge Diaghilev. And when he heard Stravinsky's music, he immediately wanted to engage him to write music for his ballet company. Now, it started off in 1909 with Stravinsky just making some orchestrations of some Chopin works. But then in 1910, Diaghilev commissioned him to write the music for this Russian fable, The Firebird. And essentially, the rest is history. Within a few years, Stravinsky produced arguably his three most famous works: the Firebird Ballet, then the very next year in 1911, the ballet Petrushka, and then in 1913, the ballet that caused so much furor, it caused a riot at its premiere, Rite of Spring, pictures of pagan Russia. And with these three ballets, Stravinsky took Rimsky-Korsakov's style and furthered it, still using Russian folk song, but juxtaposing very complex overlays of complex rhythms, ostinatos, and harmonic patterning, sort of layered like a pastiche thing, like very much to my mind, like Cubist painting. If you think of a Picasso painting, it's that same sort of overlay. He furthered, for sure, Rimsky-Korsakov's orchestrational brilliance, and with each new work had more complex techniques for the orchestra, as well as just creating a larger orchestra, to the point where when we get to the Rite of Spring in 1913, we have this gargantuan orchestra with 8 horns, 5 basically of each woodwind, using auxiliaries like piccolo, alto flute, 2 bass clarinets, 2 English horns, and on and on. So it was really the apex of this sort of growth that began in the Romantic period. But at the start of the First World War in 1914, the music world changed substantially, and especially that was the case for Stravinsky. Switzerland, for the Stravinsky family, had always been a bit of a getaway place where they spent part of each year, and that served as a springboard for Stravinsky to be closer to Western European capitals like Paris. But when the war started, he found himself in exile there. And then, by the time the Bolshevik Revolution came around in Russia in 1917, he was essentially in permanent exile from his native land. So he was kind of stuck. Furthermore, the financial stress of the First World War left European orchestras in dire straits. They were very unprepared to do much of anything, much less the gargantuan sort of projects that Stravinsky was used to. Furthermore, Stravinsky was cut off from the revenue of his royalties from his publishers because they were in both Germany and Russia. And furthermore, he was cut off from his family holdings in Russia. So here he was in Switzerland, broke and without any idea of projects. So in that light, he sat around and sort of mused with a friend of his, the Swiss writer C.F. Remus, about doing something manageable, something that they could afford to pull off, and that they could then use and tour through the area in modest venues, maybe a church or a school or something like that. And so this is where this History of a Soldier was born. Now, the story for this is of Russian folk origin, but it's really broader than that. It is the classic Faust tale of making a deal with the devil. So in this case, a young soldier is on leave, and so he's walking back to his home village to see his mother and his fiancée, stops to take a break and rummages through his knapsack and eventually pulls out his violin, which of course in this case is going to represent his soul. And he begins playing on it, and that interests a little old man who's nearby, who's actually, he's hiding behind that guise. He's actually the devil. And he comes up to the soldier and says, "I'd like your fiddle." And the soldier, of course, doesn't want to give it to him, and so they work out a deal. He says, "I'll trade you this book for it." And he claims it's a magic book, which after some twisting of arms, the soldier agrees. "Okay, fine, we'll do this." Then the soldier, or rather the devil, starts to try to play the violin. Of course, it doesn't work at all. So he says, "You've got to come with me. Come to my place." And for a few days. And the soldier protests, saying he's on a limited leave. But after much arguing, he says, "Yes, I'll come along." So he spends a few days with the devil in his palace, eating sumptuous food, having champagne, cigars, having a wonderful time. But when that period is up, the devil says, "All right, I'm going to stick to my agreement. I'm taking you back." So he takes him back and plops him right back where he was before. And the soldier merrily goes on about his way, going back to his hometown, only to find out he's completely alienated. People either don't recognize him or they run away. His mother runs away. When he sees his fiancée, she is married and has 3 children. So it dawns on him, what happened to me here was not a 3-day excursion, but rather several years. And so he realizes he's been cheated by the devil at this time. And he is completely at a loss as to what to do. Whereupon the devil shows up again and says, "Silly, I gave you this book, use it." And so the devil instructs him and makes him understand how to use the book and become a merchant. And he ends up being this incredible merchant. He sells whatever people want. He's in high demand. He makes money hand over fist. And so he's supposedly got all he would ever need materially. But quickly he realizes that that's no substitute for what he's lost. And so he begins to get very depressed about that situation. And of course then, periodically the devil makes appearances. So in the guise of a little old peddler woman, the devil comes back and wants to sell this very wealthy and successful merchant some wares, which don't interest the soldier at all, of course, until the little old woman pulls out his violin. And he very much wants to buy it, and the devil essentially says, well, no, you have to prove to me you can play it. And so he picks it up to play it, and it doesn't work for him anymore. He's extremely frustrated, and he hurls the instrument and rips up the book. And long story short, he ends up just divesting himself of all of the wealth that he had and just wandering. And so one day he's at a cafe somewhere, and he hears this decree that's being pronounced by the king of the kingdom. And this is set in some sort of universal place. You don't have any particular idea where this is. So the king of the kingdom has this decree that his daughter, the princess, is ill in bed. She doesn't eat, she doesn't move, she doesn't do anything. And whosoever can come to the palace and cure his daughter, make her well, shall have her hand in marriage. And so he thinks to himself, why not? That's worth a shot. Only to once again encounter the devil when he goes there. The devil with his violin. And so he realizes he's powerless, but then it occurs to him, the only way I can break free of the devil is to get rid of all the things the devil has made possible for me, has given to me. And so he decides to play the devil at a game of cards, knowing, of course, that the devil will never allow himself to lose. And so he plays the devil and consistently loses until he's taken all his possessions, all his money, and wagered them and lost them. And at that point, the devil has no hold over him. He becomes very weak, and he gets back his violin, and he goes off to the palace. And when he's admitted to see the princess, he serenades her with his violin, brings her out of her coma, out of her illness, and eventually they get married. In the meantime, the devil interjects in the context of the play, saying, well, you may have won this one, but I'm out there. So if you try to get beyond the peace and success that you've had now, I'll be waiting for you. And sure enough, at some point after they've gotten married, they've been together, the princess wants to know more about him. She says, I hardly know you or about your past. Why don't we go visit your old village? And somehow he knows that that's not the right thing to do, that that's going to be dangerous. But she convinces him to do this. So they agree to make a trek to his old village, and maybe he can reacquaint himself with, and her, with his mother, and all will be good again. But as the devil is warned, that doesn't work that way. So as soon as they start to make the crossing into his village, the devil awaits and takes him away to hell. So it's a wonderful, colorful story based on that Faust legend, and done with the greatest economy of means. So you have this play that, in contrast to what Stravinsky used to have at his disposal, this only used, as far as the acting troupe, 3 actors. One is a narrator, then the soldier and the devil. And then there is a dancer to represent the princess. As far as the instrumental components, there are only 7 musicians. And Stravinsky very carefully chose a pair of instruments from each family. So there's the violin and the bass, encompassing as much of the full pitch range as possible. Likewise with the woodwinds, he picks a clarinet and bassoon. Then with the brass, a trumpet and a trombone. And then on top of all of that, there's a bevy of percussion, a whole set of drums, then amplified by auxiliary instruments like tambourine, triangle, cymbals, and so on. So this project was put together and was actually a big success. It was first performed in Lausanne, Switzerland in September of 1918. But the funny thing is, right after that premiere, the Spanish flu swept through that area, and half of the troupe, at least, was stricken with this, And the whole tour was abandoned, and in fact this piece was not performed for another several years. So it's interesting how that parallels our situation with today, how the pandemic of that century really put a stop to one of Stravinsky's most interesting projects. But this piece is a significant change for Stravinsky, of course, in terms of instrumentation. But his basic approach doesn't really change. You still have the complex rhythms and ostinatos that sort of generate the flow of the music. You have abstract music and melodic clashes, edgy harmonies, but still with a tonal center. There's still use of Russian folk melodies, but Stravinsky begins to draw from other sources, and this marks kind of the start of his turn away from his Russian roots. Now, it's unclear whether he was just feeling that because he was in exile, or because this is about the internationalism, perhaps, of the First World War, or he was just trying to make it as universal as possible within the context of the story. But not only does he use Russian-based folk melodies, but he goes all over the map, and I'll sort of take you through that. He opens with a march that kind of highlights that sense of, the melodic movement being dissonant against the various melodies, dissonant against one another, and creating an intriguing harmonic sound. And then, of course, a lot of use of ostinato, and of course the string bass is perfect for that. But it starts off with a march that goes like this. And then we get this ostinato. Last little fanfare that you heard is something that it's akin to a sort of reveille on the bugle, and it's used throughout. You'll hear it tossed around through the clarinet and other instruments, violin, and so on, this bit. So it's just two triads a step apart, and that's kind of a signifier of this sort of plastic use of tonality in a pastiche kind of way. So that will come up as a sort of a reveille theme. And it's interesting too when the soldier sits down and first plays his fiddle, you get another ostinato in the bass, like you had more of a thumpy one at that opening. But it's again well rooted in tonality. And then the violin comes in, this sort of scratchy violin motive. And that motive and the ostinato below it will occupy the majority of this piece, this introductory piece in Scene 1, before the devil approaches. But then we move on to when the soldier shows up at the palace to try his hand at healing the princess. Stravinsky utilizes something that, by his own admission, he had pulled from hearing off the street in Seville when he was visiting Spain at some point. This was like a street band playing a paso doble. So he does his own version of a paso doble, which at the opening has the boisterous trombone start with the melody. So it goes like this. Following that right away is a very florid sort of motive with the trumpet, which is this kind of virtuosity you hear throughout. And underneath that is a perpetual ostinato going. And this is a very typical kind of repetition and ostinato that generates Stravinsky's music. but there's a little bit of an international flair with using that. Then when the soldier gets into the prince's chamber to try and heal her through his music, the first thing he plays to kind of awaken her is an Argentinian tango. And so you get this kind of thing, just violin and percussion. And I'll represent all the percussion with my knuckle right now. It's interesting, this little motive that you heard the soldier scratch out earlier comes back, so you're sort of reminded of his origins. Then the music goes right into a waltz, and then even into ragtime, which is another interesting aspect. All European composers were fascinated with what was coming out of America in ragtime, and then of course Harlem jazz, and so they were eagerly getting the sheet music or going to visit. Well, a friend of his brought some sheet music back of ragtime, and not only did he incorporate that dance style in this piece, but he wrote a separate ragtime chamber piece for 11 instruments around this same time, and even wrote a piano rag piece that he dedicated to Anton Rubinstein. So he was really trying his hand, of course fascinated by the rhythm, but it's just this little kind of... so on and so forth. So it's an interesting chain of dances from an Argentinian tango to say, a Viennese waltz, to a ragtime. Then I think one of the other more interesting borrowings is when the play gets moralistic after the soldier and the princess have united. There are all these admonitions, which is very interesting, of course, for this time, the war and the pandemic. Basically saying, be happy with what you have. You can't have everything. If you're at peace, you can't go back and grab the part of life that you had before. Be content with what you have. And so what better choice for such a textual delivery than a good old-fashioned Lutheran chorale. And so he presents a grand chorale in his terms that sort of provide this setting, and yet it's a very simple chorale with a simple tune, but on the other hand it's got that piquancy of harmonies based on the individual lines moving in their own independent ways. So I'll play for you a little bit of this grand chorale that will be then interspersed with text, but you get an idea of the sound of this, so listen. So while keeping in a tonal context and evoking the spirit of a simple chorale, he nonetheless provides his own sort of edginess to that, which is very characteristic. So this piece is really a monumental shift for Stravinsky, and really a real turning point for him, not only in going from the luxury of huge orchestras to small chamber groups, but also getting out of that, as they've described, a Russian period where things are based on Russian history, Russian folk tunes, and so on, and try to get this more cosmopolitan view. And that's exactly what he did in various ways and stages. after this point. But it is really a very, very fascinating work. We are pleased to have actors from Atlantic Stage and dancers from the Myrtle Beach School of the Performing Arts help us tell this story. So we hope you can join us. We are, in this case, we do have limited seating, and tickets may still be available. So you might want to call our offices at 843-448-8379 or get online, longbaysymphony.com, to see if you have any in-person tickets available to you. But if that doesn't work out, we're also live streaming this as well. So I think it's the kind of sort of multimedia adventure that is a lot of fun, not only to see the musicians, but to hear this story, a little bit of dancing thrown in. So I hope we fulfill the mission, the initial mission that Stravinsky and C.F. Ramuz were hoping for when they developed this. So we hope to see you in person or online on Sunday, March 28th for The History of a Soldier, or The Soldier's Tale. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of Speaking of the Arts. Be on the lookout for our next episode with Long Bay Symphony Executive Director Shannon Farrow, leading a discussion with her counterparts from other local arts organizations, and with Myrtle Beach Mayor Brenda Bethune about their responses to COVID in our community over this past year. Until then, stay safe and keep listening.